The sun dipped low over London, casting a golden haze across the sprawling courtyard of Buckingham Palace. It was late afternoon, the hour when the light softened, bathing the ancient stones in a warm, almost sacred glow. Tourists milled about, their voices a lively hum, cameras clicking, children darting between parents, and guides reciting well-worn facts about the monarchy. Yet, amid the bustle, there was a stillness that anchored the scene, the silent, stoic figures of the Queen's Guard, standing resolute in their scarlet tunics and bearskin hats. Their faces were impassive, their movements precise, as if carved from the very history of the place. To the crowd, they were a spectacle, a living postcard. But to one man, they were something more. Arthur Reynolds, 85 years old, walked slowly through the courtyard, his hand clasped tightly around that of his grandson. Liam, a boy of 10 with wide, curious eyes. Arthur's frame was stooped, his steps measured, but there was a quiet dignity in his bearing, a remnant of the young Royal Marine who had once stood tall. His coat hung loosely on his shoulders, and a faded regimental pin glinted on his lapel. Liam, in a bright blue jacket, looked up at his grandfather, sensing something unspoken in the way Arthur's gaze lingered on the palace gates. The boy didn't yet understand the weight of the moment, but he felt it all the same, a pull, like the tide, drawing them towards the heart of the scene. The crowd parted as they approached the black iron railings, where a young guardsman stood at his post. The soldier's eyes were fixed forward, his rifle held steady, his body a statue of discipline. Arthur stopped a few feet away, his breath shallow but deliberate. Liam tugged at his hand, whispering, "Grandpa, why is he not moving?" Arthur didn't answer immediately. His eyes, still sharp despite the years, traced the lines of the guardsman's uniform, the polished buttons, the rigid posture. It was as if he were seeing not just this soldier, but 1,000 others comrades from long ago, faces lost to time. Then, with a slow, purposeful motion, Arthur raised his right hand. His fingers, gnarled by age, formed a salute as crisp and proud as it had been 60 years before, when he'd stood on the decks of a warship bound for conflict. The gesture was simple, almost unremarkable in the chaos of the courtyard, yet it carried a weight that seemed to still the air. The crowd, caught off guard, began to quiet. A few tourists lowered their cameras. A woman with a selfie stick paused, her smile fading as she sensed something profound unfolding. The guardsman, Corporal Thomas Bennett, remained motionless at first. His training demanded it. Eyes forward, no reaction, no deviation. But something in Arthur's salute, in the unwavering resolve of that old man's gaze, reached him. It was a look Thomas had never seen from the endless stream of onlookers, a look that spoke of shared sacrifice, of battles fought in the dark corners of the world. For a fleeting moment, Thomas's eyes flickered toward Arthur. Then, against all protocol, he returned the salute. His movement was subtle, almost imperceptible to those too far to notice. But to Arthur, it was everything. A ripple passed through the crowd. A murmur grew, soft at first, then louder, as people began to understand what they'd witnessed. An elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A man in a flat cap, his own military pin gleaming on his chest, straightened and saluted too, his hand trembling. The moment was no longer just Arthur's. It belonged to everyone there, a bridge between the living and the ghosts of the past. Liam, still holding his grandfather's hand, felt a lump in his throat, though he couldn't name the emotion. He only knew that something sacred had happened, something he would carry for years to come. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with meaning. No one spoke, but the air was thick with unspoken stories. A young mother, her phone forgotten in her hand, watched Arthur with a reverence she hadn't expected to feel. A group of school children, usually restless, stood still, their teacher whispering to them about about respect. Another veteran, leaning on a cane, joined the salute, his eyes glistening as he remembered friends who never made it home. Arthur's voice, when it came, was low but clear, cutting through the quiet like a bell. "We don't salute for ourselves," he said, his words directed to Liam, but carrying to those nearby. "We salute for the ones who couldn't come back." Liam looked up at his grandfather, his young mind grappling with the weight of those words. He didn't fully understand, not yet, but the seed was planted. A quiet lesson in gratitude and duty. The crowd, too, felt the impact. A man in a business suit, who had been checking his watch moments before, now stood rooted, his expression softened. A teenage girl, earbuds dangling, wiped her eyes and turned to her father, whispering, "Why am I crying?" The moment lingered, unbroken, as if time itself had paused to honor it. As the crowd began to disperse, the story of Arthur's salute took on a life of its own. Clara, a 22-year-old history student from Bristol, had been among the onlookers, her phone capturing the scene not for likes, but for something deeper. That night, in her small flat, she wrote a blog post titled, "The Salute That Stopped Time." Her words were raw, unpolished, but they carried the truth of what she'd seen. An old man's gesture, a soldier's response, and a crowd united in a fleeting moment of humanity. She posted it at midnight, expecting a few shares from her classmates. By morning, it had gone viral, shared across continents, translated into languages she didn't speak. Comments poured in stories of other veterans, other salutes, other moments when the past reached out to touch the present. The ripple spread further. In a quiet pub in Kent, a retired colonel read Clara's post and felt a stirring in his chest. He called old comrades, men and women who had served decades ago, and proposed a gathering, a memorial for the forgotten, a chance to honor the bonds forged in war. They met a month later, dozens of them, their medals polished, their stories shared over pints and tears. The event made the local news, then the national papers, each headline tracing back to that single salute at Buckingham Palace. Back at his barracks, Corporal Thomas Bennett sat alone in his bunk, the day's duties done. The weight of the moment still clung to him. He wasn't one for words, but he felt compelled to write. Pulling out a sheet of paper, he penned a letter to his younger sister, a nurse in Manchester. "It's why we stand," he wrote, his handwriting steady, not for the crowds, but for the ones who stood before us. He sealed the envelope, knowing she'd understand, knowing she'd keep it safe. For Thomas, the salute had been a reminder of why he wore the uniform, why he endured the long hours and the rigid discipline. It wasn't about glory, it was about legacy. The story of Arthur and Thomas, of the salute that broke through the noise of the world, continued to spread. It wasn't just a moment anymore. It was a movement, a call to remember what sacrifice meant. Clara's blog became a touchstone, quoted in sermons, shared in classrooms, and discussed on radio shows. The retired colonel's memorial grew into an annual event, drawing veterans from across the country. And Thomas, though he returned to his post the next day, as if nothing had changed, carried Arthur's salute with him, a quiet strength that steadied him through every shift. In the weeks that followed, Arthur and Liam returned to their small house in Sussex, the memory of that day, a warm light in their lives. Arthur didn't seek the spotlight, he never had, but he felt the world shift, just a little, because of what he'd done. Liam, too, was changed. He asked more questions now, about the war, about the man Arthur had known, about what it meant to be brave. And Arthur, with the patience of a man who had seen too much, answered as best he could, knowing that the true lessons would come not from words, but from the life his grandson would choose to live. The story of Arthur's salute had woven itself into the fabric of countless lives, a quiet thread that connected strangers across time and distance. In the small Sussex home where Arthur and Liam lived, the days after the event settled into a familiar rhythm. But something had shifted. The world felt a little closer, as if the walls of their modest living room now held echoes of the courtyard at Buckingham Palace. Evenings found Arthur in his worn armchair, a cup of tea cooling on the table, while Liam sprawled on the rug, his schoolbooks forgotten. The boy's questions came faster now, each one a spark struck from the memory of that day. One chilly night, with rain tapping against the windows, Arthur began to tell stories he hadn't shared in years. His voice, rough but steady, carried Liam back to the war, to the biting cold of a North Atlantic convoy. The deafening roar of artillery, the fragile hope of letters from home, creased and smudged from being read too many times. He spoke of mates who'd laughed through the fear, of men who'd never made it back to their families. Liam listened, his eyes wide, the weight of history settling into his young heart. "Grandpa," he asked, his voice small but earnest, "do I have to wear a uniform to be a soldier?" Arthur paused, his gaze drifting to the faded photograph on the mantel. A younger version of himself, flanked by comrades, their smiles defiant against the backdrop of war. "No, lad," he said finally, his words deliberate. "You don't need a uniform. Being a soldier means living right, standing for what's true, even when it's hard. It's about protecting what matters, whether you're in a trench or just walking down the street." Liam nodded, not fully grasping the depth of the answer but feeling its truth. The lesson was subtle, planted like a seed in fertile soil, ready to grow as the years shaped him. The ripple of Arthur's salute continued to spread beyond their quiet home. A letter arrived one morning, its envelope crisp, the handwriting precise and unmistakably military. It was from Corporal Thomas Bennett, the guardsman who had returned Arthur's salute. The note was brief, as if written by a man unaccustomed to lingering over words. "Sir, your salute reminded me why I serve. Thank you." Arthur read it silently, his fingers tracing the ink. He didn't write back. There was no need. The answer had been in the salute itself, a shared understanding that transcended words. He tucked the letter into a drawer, alongside other keepsakes from a life of duty. Clara's blog, meanwhile, had taken on a life of its own. What began as a late-night post had grown into something far greater. A documentary filmmaker, moved by her words, reached out, and soon the salute was born, a short film that captured not just Arthur's moment, but the stories it had inspired. The premiere was held in a small London theatre, packed with veterans, historians, and ordinary people who'd been touched by the story. Arthur, reluctant at first, attended at Liam's insistence. When the film ended, the room erupted in a standing ovation, the applause rolling over Arthur like a wave. He stood, his hand on Liam's shoulder, and gave a single nod, not for the praise, but for the recognition of what the salute had meant. Time moved forward, as it always does, carrying Arthur and those around him toward the inevitable. 4 years later, at the age of 89, Arthur passed quietly in his sleep, his heart finally at rest. His funeral was small, held in a village church with stained glass windows that caught the morning light. The pews were filled with neighbors, a few old comrades, and Liam, now a young man of 14, his face set with a grief that felt too big for his frame. But there was another figure there, one who drew whispers from the mourners. Captain Thomas Bennett, no longer a corporal, stood at the back in full dress uniform, his bearskin hat tucked under his arm. As the service ended and Arthur's coffin was carried out, Thomas stepped forward. He stopped beside the casket, his posture rigid, and raised his hand in a final salute. The gesture was as crisp as it had been that day at Buckingham Palace, but it carried a new weight, a farewell to a man who had reminded him of the deeper purpose of his service. Liam, standing nearby, felt his chest tighten. He reached into his pocket, where Arthur's old regimental pin rested, and pinned it to his jacket. Then, with a steadiness he didn't know he had, he returned Thomas's salute. The moment was brief, but it closed a circle, binding 2 generations through a single, timeless gesture. The churchyard fell silent as the coffin was lowered. The only sound, the soft rustle of leaves in the autumn breeze. Liam stood tall, the pin glinting on his chest, a young man carrying his grandfather's legacy. Thomas, before leaving, placed a hand on Liam's shoulder, a wordless acknowledgement of the bond they now shared. The mourners dispersed, but the story lingered, carried forward by those who had witnessed it. In the years that followed, the salute became more than a film. It became a symbol. Schools screened it for Remembrance Day. Veterans groups used it to spark conversations about sacrifice. Liam grew into adulthood, his path shaped by Arthur's words, by the stories of courage and quiet duty. He never wore a uniform, but he lived with the integrity his grandfather had spoken of, standing for what was right in his own way. And somewhere, in the collective memory of a nation, Arthur's salute endured a reminder that every uniform tells a story, and every salute is a promise, kept across generations, to honor those who stood before